All right, as promised, our guest today is David Rovics. David is an incredible singer-songwriter, podcaster, and writer. He often lends his immense talents to issues like the fight to free Assange and Palestinian resistance. He is currently on tour in Europe with dates coming up in both France and England. He will also be in London on February 20th and 21st for the Day X court hearings for journalist and publisher Julian Assange, as we just talked about at the top of the show. You can check out more information for all of his work at his website, davidrovics.com. By the way, that's Rovics. And you can also follow him over on Twitter at @DRovics. David, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Misty. Great to be with you.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I've been, as I mentioned at the top of the show, I've been like low key stalking your career for many years now. I became aware of you through the Assange movement. Obviously, we have that very much in common. So obviously, let's start there. How did you get involved in the Assange movement? What drew you to it? And I guess we'll just start there, and then we'll talk about the Day X stuff.
Well, I think I first became, at least as far as I recall, I first became aware of WikiLeaks and the fantastic work that they're doing when Chelsea Manning got out of the military base with all that information about U.S. war crimes in Iraq. But it may have been before that. But I mean, since then, it's the WikiLeaks has just been a profoundly important force on the planet as in terms of exposing government corruption all over the world and war crimes committed by the U.S. and the U.K. and many other countries. I mean, they've been indispensable, and that's why the U.S. is and so many other countries hate Assange and want to see him dead. I mean, but the U.S. is the worst of them, and is the one that's trying to extradite him, and where he faces 175 years in prison. So I mean, I've always been a fan of Julian and of WikiLeaks, and I think it's completely you could see why the powers that be don't like him, and it's the campaign against him has just been something else to behold. As you know, I mean, the propaganda has just been incredible.
Isn't it intense?
Such disinformation. Yeah, so
it's intense. Like that's I think the most, or I guess there's a lot of fascinating aspects to this case. And I use that term very loosely because they don't have a case, but this situation, whatever you want to call it. But the amount, David, the amount of time and money and energy and resources that have been spent by not just one country, by multiple countries to destroy this one human being is fascinating to me. I think that really speaks to the power of legitimate journalism, right?
Yeah, it sure does. And it also speaks to the vindictiveness and the illegality and the cruelty that governments like ours and like the UK and like Sweden are willing to resort to punish somebody that does the kind of journalism that Julian Assange has done. I mean, it's such a terrible example for the rest of the world, because of course anybody else who's planning on facilitating massive leaks about war crimes in the future is going to be thinking really hard about whether they want to be going to prison for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. And I think that's really, I mean, that's the crux of it all. It's obviously they want Julian Assange silenced. They would like to, I think, frankly, they would like to see him dead. But I think it's so much bigger than that. I think, and I say this all the time, and I apologize to people who listen to me regularly for sounding a bit like a broken record, but I think it's an important point to make, is that he's essentially just being used as the warning. He, as I often do, I will liken him to, he's the head on a stake outside the castle walls, right? He is the threat to other journalists and, as a byproduct of that, whistleblowers all across the world, that if you mess with us, this is what we will do to you. This is what you will have to go through. And I think that that's been incredibly effective. I mean, we see the state of journalism. It's a dumpster fire. To be fair, I don't mean to sound completely cynical. There are a tremendous amount of journalists out there who are doing unbelievable work under really tenuous circumstances, risking their lives. I mean, we can talk about the journalists in Palestine later on, but that's just one example. There are people doing great work, but I think the state of, obviously mainstream press, it is a disaster. So I think that's been it's been caused a very effective chilling effect across journalism and whistleblowing. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
No doubt about it at all. But it's in terms of journalists, it's just been one of the things that's been so interesting to me in terms of like being involved with this campaign and seeing how many journalists around the world are very passionately supportive of Julian, and including organizations that journalists internationally are involved with, and journalists of so many different countries. When journalists are actually organizing as journalists, one of the top things that they are involved with is supporting Julian Assange. But what you can see so plainly is that journalists, by and large, I mean, freelancers aside, journalists who are working for some outlet, which is usually some corporate outlet or some state controlled outlet somewhere, they don't get to choose what they do stories on. They don't get to fly themselves to London to cover a story that they want to cover. Somebody else has to decide to do that. And clearly, it is no longer fashionable to be sympathetic with Julian Assange. It's no longer fashionable for the Western press to cover anything related to him. And, every time I'm in London, when there are events going on around the royal courts, one of the really striking things to see is that most of the journalists are not from the UK, and they're certainly not from the US either.
Right.
They're generally often from outside of Europe, or maybe one or two from other European countries, but nobody local.
No. In the United States, it's horrific. It's so pathetic, the lack of journalism on display surrounding this case, because frankly, they should be embarrassed. Like, forget the incredible implications that this case has over the future of press freedom, which, if you are a journalist, you should be incredibly concerned by. So forget the fact that they're not covering it just based on that. But it's a story, David. It is a story. I mean, it is a journalist who is being held in the UK's Guantanamo for exposing war crimes and corruption, and there's been all of these. I mean, all the spies and intrigue, and there's sex, and there's all of the things. It's a juicy story, and then the idea that they're still not covering it doesn't blow my mind, because I realize why they're not covering it. But if I were a journalist in the mainstream, and I don't know that I could look at myself in the mirror, and I certainly wouldn't be calling myself a journalist. It is embarrassing that they are not covering the story. Really? So, okay, listen, we got to take a quick break and get some headlines. Hang tight. We're going to be back here on today's News Talk.
TNT. Here's what's making news. TNT Radio News.
For TNT, this is James O'Neill. The U.S. has launched airstrikes in Baghdad, targeting individuals linked to a recent attack in Jordan that resulted in the deaths of 3 American service members. During a fundraiser in New York City, President Joe Biden labeled former President Donald Trump as an existential threat, emphasizing the urgency of preventing Trump from undermining his administration's achievements. President Joe Biden mistakenly claimed to have discussed the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot with former German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who had passed away nearly 4 years prior to the riot.
Why not give TNT Radio a follow? We're on all major social platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Gab, and Getter. Help us get the word out as we cover the biggest topics of our time, right here on today's News Talk. TNT Radio. TNT Radio.
All right, we're here with David Robics. And by the way, if you're going to follow us on social media, also do the share, subscribe, like, comment, all of those things. Help us get through the algorithms. We're pretty heavily shadow banned, not surprising. Okay, so we're here with David Robics. We're talking about the work that he's done over the years for the campaign to free Julian Assange. Obviously, we speak about that quite a bit here on this show with no apologies made for it. I will continue to talk about it a lot, especially in these next couple of weeks here as we approach the Day X court dates in on February 20th and 21st. So I know that you plan to be at the courts in London on February 20th and 21st. And this is really kind of the Hail Mary pass to prevent extradition to the United States. I'm not going to ask you to make a prediction because it is impossible to know what's going to happen. Nothing in this situation makes any sense whatsoever. But I think that what I will ask you is that I've noticed as somebody who's done, a fair bit of activism on this front myself, that the support for Julian has, as you briefly talked about just before the break there, it has grown immensely certainly since he was essentially kidnapped from the Ecuadorian embassy. But even before then, I think that was already kind of snowballing. But I think that we have reached a point now where there is just such a tremendous amount of support that it's becoming even more difficult for them to continue this. So would you agree with that? And do you think that that's going to have any impact whatsoever on his situation?
I mean, like I don't want to switch topics or anything, but just when you see the millions and millions of people marching around the world, calling for a ceasefire, calling for an end to this genocide in Gaza, and the lack of response on the part of the powers that are committing the genocide, or arming Israel and sending them billions and all that. I mean, whether anybody's listening in the British establishment or the U.S. establishment, are they listening to all the voices calling to free Julian? I mean, it seems that they don't listen to popular opposition necessarily, but of course we have to do everything we possibly can to try to make them listen, and hope that there's possibility, that could, enough attention could actually make something happen. I mean, it's I wish I could say that I was hopeful about our capacity to influence these monsters that run these countries. I mean, I don't think I think the vast majority of the members of the British Parliament and the American Congress are sociopaths, and I think you can't get to that position. I mean, some people can't, but I think the vast majority don't get to, and it's very difficult to get to that position unless you're both rich and a sociopath. I think these qualities are pretty much essential for the job, and I don't think that's the case in governments around the world by any means, but in these countries it certainly is the case. Other countries are more civilized, they're not entirely run by money. There's much more democracy in a lot of other countries, but the US and the UK, especially the US, is extremely, and as Howard Zinn often was fond of saying, two parties, that's only one more than one party. It's not
it's really just a uniparty. Yeah, it's really just the one party. They do a good job, I think, at least to the untrained observer, to the average American citizen. I think they do a good job of presenting the illusion of choice. They do a good job of pretending that they are two different parties and that they're not completely owned and operated by the exact same people. But they are. They are owned and operated by the exact same people. They serve the same agenda. And really, it's basically just a soap opera with psychopaths. Like it's just a show. They present to us the way that they conduct themselves amongst each other. And listen, I have no doubt that there are cliques, and there are people that like each other more than others, and there are people that go to dinner together and people that can't stand each other. It's probably just like high school, only with really rich, unwell people. But I think they really do serve the same exact agenda. And there's just, at this point, I don't know how anybody could possibly deny it when it doesn't matter who the president is. The agenda remains the same on essentially on war and Wall Street. It's the same thing, and everything else I think is used to keep the people divided. So I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's very frustrating to watch that. I'm glad that you're saying it openly and honestly, though, because I say stuff like that all the time, that they don't care what we think, and people call me a cynic. But that when I say that, I'm just being honest about the situation. I don't mean we shouldn't try. Obviously, I'm trying. Like, I'm still doing stuff. I just think you need to be realistic about the situation that we're in, right?
Yeah, I mean, look at history. Look at the millions and millions of people that were protesting against the Vietnam War all over the world. Did they stop bombing Vietnam? I mean, but all those people in the streets, maybe they stopped them from using nuclear weapons. I mean, so, and I've heard people, who are much more knowledgeable about that period of history than I am, say that's quite likely the case. That if not for all those people in the streets, they would have resorted to nuclear weapons, and that. So, well, okay, I guess we can, let's keep on being in the streets and hope that we can at least moderate their genocidal practices. In terms of support for Assange, one of the most interesting things I came across just over the past couple of years, when this fundraising efforts were being made in his defense, is when there was the possibility to donate by cryptocurrency. More than half of the people donating came from China, small donors from China. And I mean, the kind of support that Assange has all over the world from people who understand, viscerally what it is that he stands for and what he's trying to do with WikiLeaks. His support is everywhere.
Yes. And you're absolutely right about that. Every time there's a global event that takes place where obviously there's a court date or there's some significant action taking place around his hearings or whatever, and we have all of these global events that pop up. And I think I just had Alex Hills on recently, who runs the Candles for Assange page. And I think she said it's like 65 cities currently and 14 or 15 different countries. I may have those numbers completely wrong. But my point is that, watching that grow over time, watching it, it be something that was kind of a fringe issue years and years ago. I mean, I was a very passive supporter myself initially. I don't know how involved you were. I know I'm very much the same as you. 2010, 2011, when the Manning leaks came out, I was instantly hooked. I was all over it. I loved it. Couldn't get enough. I'm like, the Dave Chappelle meme where he's the crackhead. Hey, you got any more of those leaks? That's how I felt. Like, oh my God, this is amazing stuff. I was immediately hooked, and I was a WikiLeaks fan from jump. But I was a very passive supporter. I wasn't, in the streets. I wasn't organizing. I wasn't doing any of those things. But it was over time that seeing the way that he was being persecuted, that's what drew me in. And I think I'm sure that there are many people listening, many people around the world who have a very similar situation where over time they saw the injustice of what was happening and their support built, and they realized that they needed to step up and get more involved. And I think just watching that, I think has been so cool, because it is legitimately grassroots, David, because this is an issue that does not get mainstream coverage. It does. In fact, it gets suppressed on all of the social media platforms. Assange posts are incredibly suppressed. YouTube suppresses it. Everywhere suppresses it. So this is a legitimate grassroots movement that has had to build from nothing to what it is now, which, as you mentioned, there are millions of people across the globe. Many of them are doing regular actions. You have people in Germany and Italy and Australia and Boston and Seattle and Tulsa and everywhere, all over the world, who are and they're fighting that fight every single day. And that's been super cool to watch that build. And I think regardless of what happens on the 20th and 21st, I think that gives me a tiny bit of hope to see the way that, and it really is kind of that post-partisan. I don't think Assange supporters care. I don't care who you voted for. I don't care what party you belong to. I don't care what books you read. I don't care what ism you subscribe to. If you would like to fight to free Julian Assange and protect the future of press freedom, welcome aboard. Happy to have you. Like, I feel like it's a very welcoming movement. Like, do you agree? I feel like it's been just such a welcoming movement. Yeah.
Oh my goodness, yes, and it is a very welcoming movement for, and it's also, well, and then the other elements of society that are not that don't think inclusively, ecumenically like that. You can hear the most wacky stuff from them, accusing Assange and his supporters of this or that type of politics just based on like things like guilt by association or whatever. I mean, this kind of mentality is rife in certain circles, certain sectors, and the more fetid sectors of the left, But it's. This is it's a bit of a aside, but I was talking about how wonderful the Assange family are, and I love his brother and his father, and I talk about them fairly often. And I was in Australia talking to somebody about what a great guys his father and his brother are. Who are traveling around. I see them, in various countries all the time because they're constantly touring and promoting the films and his case. And somebody said, "Oh, the Assange family are right adjacent," whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. And what apparently it means is like if you appear on a Fox show, then you become right adjacent. I
genuinely despise that mentality. Listen, John Shipton is one of the nicest guys I've ever met. He's incredibly funny, and his son is currently being tortured in prison. I don't know about you. I will go anywhere. I would talk to anybody. I'll go talk. You want me to talk to the KKK? I'll talk to the KKK. If it means spreading the word about my child and trying to save their life, absolutely. Sign me up. I'm talking to them. That mentality is so ridiculous. Okay, listen, we got to take another quick break. Hang tight. We're going to be right back here on TNT.
De-weaponizing weather with reality and perspective.
The cyclone that's in the north of Australia is kind of unusual for an El Nino season. That's because we have not really had an El Nino season this year in Australia. The Southern Oscillation Index, the longest running measure of the ENSO, or El Nino, La Nina, has not cooperated at all. And we knew this was a problem way back in the Northern Hemisphere fall and our spring, because we weren't seeing a lot of typhoons. Usually when you have a big El Nino, you have a lot of typhoons going off, and we had the third lowest typhoon production on record, so something funky was going on. However, that Southern Oscillation Index is going to crash for the month of February, which means that our fall should be average in Australia. Now, I'm bringing all this up because that crash in February is linked to severe cold in the United States and Europe for February into March. And we're seeing another ferocious storm attacking Norway now. A lot of heavy rain is coming into Europe over the next week. Now, the two times that happened, it turned frigid in Europe. Same thing is going to happen. Mid-February to mid-March will be frigid in Europe. You see all these storms crashing into the United States? Well, guess what? It's going to turn frigid in the United States. In fact, for much of the United States, the worst of the winter is on the way. And just think, it all hinges on looking at the weather around Australia. Isn't that nice? Hands across the water. Australia, the States, and Europe. Kumbaya. This is TNT climate and weather watchdog meteorologist Joe Bastardi, asking you to enjoy the weather. It's the only weather you've got.
Our beautiful world is changing, withering, dying, by the hands of those who don't value nature, even though we all depend on it for life itself. But there is hope. Together with caring friends, the Nature Conservancy can restore our lands and save our wildlife with big solutions only nature can provide. To learn more, visit nature.org today.
You're with Misty Winston on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, we are here with David Rovics, who is an incredible musician, artist, activist, writer. You name it, he does it all. He's currently on tour. If you would like to find, he's in France and England. If you would like to find dates for that, you can go to davidrovics.com. It's ROVICS. You can check out all of the dates for that. Find him. He'll also be in London, like we mentioned, on February 20th and 21st for the Day X court hearings for Julian Assange. Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit. You briefly touched on Palestine earlier, and I know that this is something that you're very passionate about, as am I myself. So I definitely wanted to talk to you about this because obviously this is it's a really horrific set of circumstances playing out in broad daylight on the world stage for everyone to see. I don't think we've ever really experienced anything like this. It is a genocide being committed. And it's live streaming, essentially. We get to see basically all of it. And it is, it's really difficult to watch. So, I mean, I know this is something that has meant a great deal to you over the years. I know you've done a lot of work on this. I don't even know like how to even approach the subject at this point, because as you said, it feels like they don't care what we think. It feels like it feels very hopeless at this point. And I hate diving into that despair because the people of Palestine need for people to not dive into that despair, but it genuinely feels tremendously hopeful. Where do you think we stand right now on the situation in Palestine?
I mean, it feels like what it must have felt to people protesting and trying to stop the U.S. war machine from slaughtering millions of people in Southeast Asia in the 60s. I mean, the desperation you wake up with every day, knowing that, while you've been asleep, your government has probably killed several hundred innocent civilians from the air, just like is happening every day in Gaza. Several hundred civilians are being killed under the bombardment every day. And that's not counting the far higher numbers that are now dying of famine and disease.
Yeah.
And they're being starved and they're not letting the food in. And it's just, I mean, what's just one of the many things that's been so striking to me over the past few months. I mean, I've been writing songs constantly and essays and whatever good that does. An album of 20 songs that I wrote between October and December about the genocide. But what's been striking is the complete, I mean, I've never actually seen in my lifetime such a contrast, although there is generally a contrast between Western media, mainstream corporate media coverage and the rest of the world's media. But the media coverage on this has been so incredibly starkly. I mean, now the Western media is pretty much ignoring it. And just every time Israel has a talking point, they run with it. And I mean, latest thing with these, they tortured people that they captured, who then said stuff about UNRWA workers being involved with the attack in southern Israel. And I mean, they just run with this kind of stuff. It's stuff that they got from torturing people, and then this is just considered to be like good information to the US and the UK and all the different Western media outlets who just unquestionably run these stories. They're just doing the work of Israeli propaganda for Israel. It's just, whereas then you look at the media in the rest of the world, and they're covering Israel as if it's a genocidal power run by mad, crazy people that are bent on killing all the Palestinians, which is the accurate. And then every time the United Nations has a press conference, they cover it. But if you want to see a UN press conference on television, I mean, maybe C-SPAN, but I don't know. I don't never watch C-SPAN. I don't know what they're doing. But it's in terms of like network coverage on any news channels, you have to look to the outside of the Western world to find any reliable. I mean, Al Jazeera will interrupt their coverage and go to wherever a head of a UN department is having a press conference. They'll interrupt their coverage and cover press conferences of Biden or Blinken. But our own country's media just pretends like it's not the case, that Biden is constantly spending most of his time in the Middle East, trying to facilitate this genocide. He says he doesn't want the war to widen, which is ridiculous. Of course, the U.S. is, as your headlines just reported, bombing Iraq, and but our press just basically ignores what our government is doing. I mean, half the Navy is somewhere between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and that's like, who's even reporting that? That our military is even there in such numbers.
Yes. And not only that, not only are they not covering the reality of what's happening on the ground, but as you just mentioned, Biden says he doesn't want this to expand into a broader regional conflict. We know that that's garbage. Who's called him out on that? Has anybody called him out on that? We know that they've been trying to initiate a conflict with Iran for a very long time. We know that we've been occupying Syria for how many years now? We know all these situations are playing out. The media knows that it's playing out, and not a single person's going to challenge Biden on that statement. Or, for example, Antony Blinken just recently said something to the effect that the United States is the largest contributor of aid to Palestine. My guy, you do not get to provide the bombs that are blowing children to bits on a daily basis and then send some bottled water and expect to get a pat on the back. That's not how that works. You don't get to do that. Not a single mainstream media outlet will challenge him on that. Not to mention the fact that Israel doesn't even let that aid get through. So you can send all the bottled water you want. It's not getting to Palestinians. So the idea that they can make these claims unchallenged, unchecked, that they can spew these lies to the American people, and not a single journalist, again, using that term very loosely, they're not journalists, but not a single one of them is going to challenge them. I mean, the best we get is, which we should give immense credit to, is Matt Lee from the AP, who will occasionally challenge them on their garbage, or somebody like Sam Husseini, who manages to get into the press room and is able to call them out on some things, or Max Blumenthal somehow got into the press room a couple times and embarrassed them handedly. It doesn't take much, David. They're liars. It's very easy to call them out. And yet, again, that's kind of coming full circle to our previous conversation. The state of mainstream media in the West is really depressing. It's really bad.
Yeah, it is. It is really depressing. And it's just been getting more depressing over the course of many decades. Although there was I would say during the golden age of the internet, like 1995 to 2005, there was a lot of good stuff happening as far as like independent websites and indie media and all kinds of stuff on the internet, which became, I mean, the free internet that existed for those 10 years was quite a powerful tool for organizing, you know, before all the social media algorithms and all that kicked in and we got, you know, totally like stuck in the closet and like the internet turned into whatever it is now, which, you know, this bizarre dystopic phenomenon. But I have friends who were actually working in local commercial radio in the 80s when Reagan came to power, and like, I mean, there's things that have happened that it just never even got any. I don't know how many people even know about this, but you know, there were thousands and thousands of local journalists working at local radio stations all over the country. And back before Reagan came to power, one person couldn't own more than one radio station. It almost seems like unbelievable. Like what kind of, like, is communism or something, you know? But you know, and every radio station in the country was required to have a news department. I mean, it's almost like unbelievable, right? Now they're all, you know, most of the radio stations are basically just repeaters for you know, whatever, you know, iHeart Music is pumping out on their, you know, same 100 song playlist or whatever for each, you know, of the 3 genres that they recognize as existing. But you know, it used to be there was this phenomenon of independent radio, independent news departments, and of course the corporations owning these various stations had their own, you know, whatever political agendas perhaps, but you know, they had to employ journalists. They had to employ local journalists that covered local issues. And that was true all over the country. And then Reagan came to power. And one of the first things that they did in the Reagan administration was deregulate radio so that one person or corporation could own 40 stations. You know, and then Clinton came to power and did that even worse. You know, he lifted the cap entirely. You know, but as soon as that bill passed under Reagan, thousands of journalists immediately lost their jobs, because as soon as the stations were no longer required to have a local a journalism, you know, a newsroom, you know, they just got rid of them all. You know, nobody, they only had them because they had to.
Yes, and that's you're right. That did start with Reagan, but I think Bill Clinton doesn't get near enough hate for the Telecommunications Act of 1996. People don't bring that up near enough, because that is the consolidation of media that we are now suffering through. That is Bill Clinton. That is I think it's now what 5 or 6 companies own like 9, and these are old numbers. Like I need to look into it, because these are numbers from like 10 or 15 years ago that I'm repeating right now. But 5 or 6 companies I think own like 90% of all media. That includes television, radio, all of it. So I mean, and we've seen I don't know if you've seen it or not, there's that mashup, I think it's of Sinclair Broadcasting, where it's the local news reporters, they're all reading the exact same script. It is so dystopian and troubling. It is, I mean, from all over the country, but they're all reading the exact same script. It is terrifying. That is terrifying. And that's really where we're at right now, that we don't have, we do have independent media. It is incredibly stifled. It is incredibly shadow banned. It's difficult, as you mentioned, with the algorithms and all of that stuff, for any legitimate, any kind of legitimate independent journalism to break through. It is being done, but it's just so difficult to get it in front of people. And then the mainstream press is just, it is nothing more than paid propagandists being repeaters for power. That's really all that it is. And
absolutely.
It's terrifying,
Absolutely.
Right, David? That's crazy.
It is absolutely terrifying. And then, of course, the great coup of the social media platforms to get us away from using, you know, the independent web and even things like email lists, and the insidious ways that they sort of, were like Facebook was a very useful in so many ways. They made themselves so useful and so free and so, you know, remarkable for a couple of years there. Just remarkable enough to get everybody who used to, you know, have email lists and all this to, you know, so many of them to abandon their email lists, just to figure, oh, now everybody's on Facebook and it works kind of like an email list, but, you know, we can see people's faces and it's cooler and more, you know, high tech. And, you know, they were just completely fooled into this, just joining this massive mega corporation that then, of course, as soon as they got all our attention and got us all to stop using email lists and all this, then they introduced these horrible algorithms and, you know, shadow banned or just outright banned, just everything, you know, it's just.
And they spy on you.
They spy on you. Absolutely. Yeah.
It's a good time.
And
it's a good time.
You just feel like Yeah, I hear people talk, people who don't understand what's going on. And there's a lot of people, including like college professors, all kinds of people who don't get it. They don't get the algorithms. They don't see what's going on, and
Yeah.
they are, like understandably depressed, isolated, lonely. They look at their Facebook feed and they think that their friends don't care about Palestine and only care about the fact that they just, maybe they, got a new dog, or their father died, or whatever makes it onto the algorithm feed, but you just don't see anything about politics because it's suppressed. So you would think nobody on Facebook is going to protest. I mean, obviously there's other platforms where you might find those things actually happening, but there's an awful lot of people, and I'm sure we both know, and certainly I know, maybe a bit older than you, there's a lot of people who just aren't anywhere other than on Facebook, and
Yes.
that's their reality, and it's so depressing.
Yeah, no, 100%. And you're right. Facebook did, I mean, really, I hate to give credit, but credit where it's due. It was an incredible bait and switch. I mean, they really did a great job of pulling everybody in, getting everybody hooked, making sure everybody was, as you said, stopping those other means of communication and dropping those other avenues of being able to, get information out, and then switched it all up. And then they started isolating you into your little echo chamber and spying on you and doing all of the things that we now know that Facebook is doing. And it's so frustrating. And I mean, we're seeing the same situation with Twitter or X or whatever Elon wants to call it. I mean, he's pretending to be this big free speech savior. He is yet to make a comment on the Julian Assange case. He is a giant Zionist who just went and played patty cake with Benjamin Netanyahu. He's not a fan of free speech either. He's not going to protect free speech either. So we need, especially those of us who are organizers and activists, we need to be mindful of that and really get back to those more basic means of communication, those email lists and things like that, because we can't depend on these social media websites for organizing efforts. That's just not a reality anymore. I don't know that it really, as you said, there might have been a couple years in there where it was useful, but they really quickly took that away. I think as soon as they saw how effective it was, they're like, nope, we can't have this. This is not okay. Okay, listen, David, we are out of time, unfortunately. I'm so glad that you came on. As I said, I've been a big fan of your work for a very long time, so it's great to be able to finally have a conversation with you. Again, David is on tour. Currently, he will be in France and in England. You can go to davidrovics.com for tickets, information, all of that stuff. Follow him on Twitter at drovics. Again, that's ROVICS. Please share his work, send it to your friends, all of that good stuff. He does fantastic stuff for both Assange, Palestine, and a whole host of other issues. So thank you so much for coming on the show today. I appreciate you very much. I'll be back tomorrow with Matthew Ho and Kelly Lane. We're going to talk about candidates for Assange. Yeah. So tune in for that. And as Julian Assange says, learn, challenge, act now. Don't go anywhere. Timothy Shays right after this, right here on Today's News Talk.